So in my role as a professor of child development, I think a lot about what makes a child successful. And I think about how do we define this? How do we measure these kinds of things? I talk about it with my students. I talk about it with my colleagues. I write about it for other professionals. And I help translate this often in working in the community. Also, as an academic, I don't go far from my notes. So they are in my hand today as I speak to you about the messages that I'm trying to convey in terms of what I hope to propose to you in the way that we think about success and the way that we work with children and youth in regards to success. And my message is this, that any definition of success must start with the quality of the relationships that children and youth build with others. Research consistently shows that how children relate and engage with others is related to both short and long-term outcomes, whether we're talking socially, emotionally, or academically. And although the relationships that children form with adults are critically important, we should not underestimate or overlook the importance of peer relationships in the lives of children and youth. Feeling connected and feeling engaged positively with one's peers is a vital developmental task that contributes to human flourishing and well-being. Now, this idea that peers play a significant role in children and youth's lives is not new. Researchers and theorists from developmental backgrounds have long talked about the unique nature of peer relationships in the lives of children and youth and the importance they have in influencing developmental outcomes. But what is new in today's world is the landscape that children and youth must navigate in their peer relationships and in their environments that they encounter peers. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about what this changing terrain looks like. You probably have heard the fact that our society is becoming more and more diverse. As migration, as immigration, as birth rates change in the US and across the globe. In this first slide, it depicts these changing environments using census data from 1980, the present, and predicting ahead to 2060 what the US population will look like. What you can see in this slide very clearly is that the US is moving to a point where we will become a majority minority by the year 2060, where more than half of the US population represents social, ethnic, and racial minorities. But children and youth today are already living this change. So this slide depicts census data for K-12 children and youth beginning in 2003 through 2025. And what you can see here is that young people today are already dealing with a majority-minority condition. That is, they are exposed to a more diverse array of peers than ever before, and their social worlds look like now what the US population's social worlds will look like in the year 2060. But this diversity is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, there is research that points out that this diversity leads to excellence, that this diversity leads to increased competence, that diversity is seen as an asset and a strength that enhances our schools, it enhances our science, it enhances our workplace, it enhances our arts and our music, and enhances our humanity. On the other hand, there is research to suggest that this diversity also contributes to conflict, to divisiveness, and to exclusion. How do we, as caring adults, help our children and youth navigate this increasingly complex and diverse social world? How do we help them profit from the benefits of diversity and avoid the negative outcomes? The answer to these questions, the things that I think and talk a lot about, have important implications for the success of our children and youth. But like many other things, these diversity data also have a catch. Although it's clear in these slides that our society is becoming more and more diverse, it's also clear that we remain as a society fairly segregated. Some of this segregation is due to institutional and systemic forces, but some of this segregation is also voluntary. There is a tendency of humans to seek out and prefer peers who are like ourselves. Simply speaking, we tend to surround ourselves with people who think like us, who look like us, who talk like us, and who hold the same beliefs and values that we do. Birds of a feather do, in fact, flock together, and we become more similar over time. Now, this tendency is not limited to adults. Children and youth segregate as well. And this segregation is not limited to race, ethnicity, or class. In fact, one of the strongest ways in which we tend to segregate across development is in terms of gender, and that has been a source of my work for quite some time. Gender segregation, the tendency of boys to prefer to be with and interact with other boys, and for girls to tend to prefer to be with and interact with other girls, is readily identifiable. You can go to any playground anywhere in the world where children are free to choose their play partners, and what you will likely see is that boys are playing mostly with other boys and girls are playing mostly with other girls. This tendency to segregate by gender begins early in development, from the moment that boys and girls are brought together in groups, and it gets stronger over time. So much so that theorists and researchers talk about the fact that boys and girls grow up in separate social worlds with limited overlap. In fact, sadly, in our work in classrooms, we have been in classrooms where not a single boy can name the name of a single girl in that classroom. And gender segregation, like all segregation, has undesirable consequences. And these consequences reinforce themselves. We have named this reinforcement cycle the segregated relationship cycle. And it's depicted in this slide. As you can see in this slide, we argue that segregated relationships lead to negative attitudes about the other group and to increased stereotyping in behaviors, to a narrowing of the range of skills, of preferences, and perceptions of fairness, and to a reduced sense of efficacy about relating to those who are different from yourself. All of this feeds back to increasing the likelihood that we spend time in segregated relationships, thereby reinforcing and sustaining the cycle of segregated relationships. Research suggests that spending too much time in segregated relationships has the potential to undermine the benefits of diversity, as it narrows the opportunities we have to interact with peers who are different from ourselves, as it creates an us versus them mentality, and as it reinforces stereotypes and stereotypic behaviors and attitudes. It has the potential to undermine what we call social resilience, the ability to effectively interact with those who are different from yourself. So in our work, we emphasize the need for adults to help children and youth break this segregation cycle and instead promote what we refer to as the inclusive relationship cycle. In the inclusive relationship cycle, Inclusive relationships contribute and lead to positive attitudes and behaviors towards those who are different. It decreases stereotypic behaviors and bias. It enhances the range of skills and preferences and perceptions of fairness one has. And it increases relationship efficacy, all feeding back into increasing the likelihood that you spend time in inclusive relationships, thereby reinforcing and sustaining the inclusive relationship cycle. In this type of cycle, time spent with others who are different from yourself, who come from different backgrounds, who solve problems differently, who think about things differently, who have different interests and attitudes than you do, enhances social resilience as it increases one's comfortableness and sense of efficacy in navigating an increasingly complex social world. When adults promote inclusive relationships and environments for their children and youth, it helps also prepare them for the adult world. It motivates them to see a positive place for them in the future and to have a sense of efficacy, that they have the skills and the experiences to get there. In essence, we argue inclusive relationships and environments promote hope. So how do we do this? How can we help our children and youth break the segregation cycle and promote the inclusive relationship cycle? Based on the work that we have done and some research of others, we have identified some key ingredients and are working to develop strategies that accomplish these goals. And I'll briefly outline those for you now. So here are the keys to promoting the inclusive relationship cycle. Number one, adults can promote the inclusive relationship cycle by setting effective inclusive social norms that set high expectations for positive behaviors and attitudes. Number two, we can promote the inclusive relationship cycle by giving children and youth a voice in the norm-setting process, giving them some ownership over these norms. Number three, we can promote the inclusive relationship cycle by purposefully mixing children up in their peer interactions, intentionally and strategically exposing them to diverse peer interactions promotes the inclusive relationship cycle. We can promote the inclusive relationship cycle by creating common goals in children's groups that promote a sense of belongingness and cooperation. And finally, we can promote the inclusive relationship cycle by creating and engaging in professional development and trainings that help adults understand and effectively manage the diverse peer relationships of their children and youth. So to conclude, I encourage you to think about and ask yourself, what am I doing to help my kids get along better? What am I doing to help them learn from each other? What am I doing to help them benefit from the diversity that surrounds us? And what am I doing to help promote their social resilience? Answering these questions can lead to inclusive relationships and environments that set a condition where hope can flourish in an increasingly diverse world, as it is our belief that hope is fostered when there is a sense of belongingness, engagement, efficacy, and trust. Thank you.